This is the first chapter of Blaze's backstory. Again, these are things I learned from Destiny, and one thing you should know, Blaze did not call himself Blaze before I gave him that nickname. He's... the best his name translates to is Serenade. So that's how I'll be referring to him in this. But that is Blaze, Serenade. Just so you've got that. Okay, Chapter 1. Red lines dissolved into color as the plains of Cinnabar formed around Serenade. He looked around and it was uncanny. It looked just like the plains of Cinnabar. And he could hear a Pidgey flying overhead. And he could feel the grass underneath his hooves. And he could smell the slight hint of sulfur in the air. But he knew it wasn't real. It may fool other Pokemon, but it wasn't enough to fool Blaze. He'd been in a Pokeball before, and he didn't give in then, and he wasn't going to give in now. The first time he'd tried to run away, but quickly realized that that didn't work. He knew he had to get out, and it was a mental thing. And focusing on the same amount of power that the same place where he got his fire from, he pushed, and the scene around him frayed into the red lines again, and they spread further and further apart the further he strained, until finally the scene broke apart, and the red lines resolved into the real world around him. It was a lot harder this time than it had been before. This Ultra Ball was much more realistic and much tougher than the Pokeball he'd experienced earlier in life. But he'd managed to break out. He was strong. However, he wasn't prepared for the net that got thrown over him. He tried to burn his way through the net, but quickly realized it was made of some kind of metallic substance. And as he fought to fight himself free, the net just got more tangled, and he couldn't quite break out. And he still had his fire, though, and raged around him, trying to keep the humans away from him. These weren't normal trainers. That was further evidenced by the fact that they began to spray him down with foam that clogged his pores and choked out his fire. His mane and his tail went out, and the foam threatened to get in his mouth and nostrils. He huffed to keep it out, but couldn't quite get as much oxygen, and his his pores felt so clogged up, and the foam almost seemed to take the heat out of him, that he felt cold and weaker, and he couldn't get his fire to ignite. He still tried to struggle against the net for a while, but finally realized he couldn't get out. Not like this, not on his own. And the humans dragged the net into a truck and closed the door, closing Serenade into cold darkness. He closed his eyes. When Blaze came to again, it was dark around him. He was still outside. Well, he was outside again, but it was completely dark. And he went to move to see what was around him. But as he went to move, his face jerked back. That his face was tethered to a stake in the ground. He pulled himself off the ground and tried to pull away from the stake, but he couldn't get it. No matter how much he ground his hooves into the ground and tried to lash forward, he couldn't get out. The stake was too far in and the chain was too strong. He tried to hold his head at a normal level, but the chain was too short for that, and he didn't feel comfortable laying down. He didn't want to be vulnerable, not around the kind of people that had captured him. And so he waited, still cold and weak, until the morning came. He could see Mount Cinnabar in the distance. As light came through and the morning finally arrived, With it came the humans. One of them held a whip, and the other approached him, trying to get him to do some commands, but he shied back and again pulled against the chain and dug his hooves in the ground. He did not want to be near these people, and he wasn't going to do things for them. He wasn't that kind of Pokemon, and especially not for these kind of people. After a little bit of him not listening to the humans, the other one came forward with the whip and began to make work on him. Serenade had gone through hard things before. He'd suffered pain, and he would still suffer pain again. Lash after lash after lash, he would not listen to these people, and he danced back and did whatever he could to stay out of reach of them, until finally the one sighed and went and pulled out a chain. And that hurt worse than anything that Serenade had experienced thus far in his life. He again danced forth and did everything that he could to pull himself away from this chain. And in his kicking and snorting, he kicked up a rock that, as he stopped to breathe and the humans made their way around, he couldn't help but notice this rock, that there was something alive about it. The same way that real life was just more than what was in a Pokeball. This rock, there was something more to it. And the human came around and hit him with the chain again, and he danced forth and his hoof hit the rock. As it did, he felt freedom through this rock and reached out to embrace it, and everything flashed around him. The chain was gone. Whatever contraption they had on his face was still there, and there was still some of the foam clogging his pores. But he was free. He was in a meadow. It was warm and safe. And he ran through the meadow just because he could. Before finally settling down, he was thirsty and hungry and in pain, and very quickly found a brook to drink from and ate some grass and just rested himself for a few hours until, as the pain slowly subsided from the cuts that were still bleeding. As he sat, he had some time to think about where he was. It was nowhere that he recognized. Cinnabar was nowhere to be seen. And he realized something else odd. He hadn't seen a single other Pokemon. There were a few other small critters that were kind of recognizable, but no Pokemon. At least not until later on, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, and Serenade heard the sound of hoofbeats through the field, and looked up to see another pony. A Pokemon he wasn't entirely sure. It wasn't anything like he had seen before. It was a Pokemon about the same size as him, but with a golden sheen to its coat. Its mane and tail were pink in color, and the pony had wings, which was odd just of its own accord. And on its flank was a depiction of Butterfree? He couldn't quite be sure. But the pony seemed nice enough, and saw his bleeding, and looked as if she wanted him to follow. And so he did. And they approached a structure like a small cottage thing, and he wondered if this must be the pony's, like where the pony's master lived. But it almost seemed to be the pony's home itself. But she cleaned him up a little bit, and he slept there for the night, and woke up in the morning, and he was feeling a lot better, but he still had no idea where he was, and just felt less and less comfortable as he ran into other ponies that were just odd colors. It wasn't his home, and while he wasn't a homebody per se, this was odd for him to be here, and he wanted to get back to Cinnabar. And the chance came as one of the ponies offered him an apple, and he could tell again, like similar to the rock, there was something more to the apple, and as he nipped at it, he could feel home, just the sense of home on the far side. When biting into the apple, he reached out for this feeling, and again everything flashed around him. And he was in the middle of a forest, and he could hear a sparrow through the trees. He knew he was back home. He could hear the sounds of fighting, and he could see a caterpie crawling up a tree. And he was like, oh, I'm back. And he made his way through the forest until he felt an electric shock zap him, and he pranced out of the way into view of a young boy and a Pikachu. And there was something about the boy that stood out, the same way as the apple and the rock. Serenade cocked his head. End of chapter 1 of Blaze's backstory.